Good morning and welcome to Infrastructure Victoria's webinar, powering through a deep dive into the challenge of managing Victoria's energy transition. I'm Jill Riseley, I'm the Acting CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel today, and we'll take you through some of not only Infrastructure Victoria's recommendations into energy, but a really rich discussion into the transition. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands right across Victoria, in particular the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands the Infrastructure Victoria office is located, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'll tell you a little bit about Infrastructure Victoria if you're not familiar with who we are. But before I do, I'll dive into a little bit of housekeeping. Um, for those who are joining us via the live stream, you can ask questions, and those questions can be found and submitted via Slido, which is just underneath the live stream on the website. You can also view the webinar with closed captions, and you'll also see a link there. Uh, Infrastructure Victoria, for those who don't know, is the independent advisor to the Victorian State Government on all things infrastructure. We provide advice to government on infrastructure. We conduct research, particularly where we think that there are gaps, and I'll mention some of the most recent research we've done into climate change impacts. And a really important role we have is also completing and updating the 30-year infrastructure strategy. And we updated our most recent version of that and tabled that in Parliament at the end of last year. And I'll take you through some of the energy-related recommendations. I'd also like to welcome our panel that we have here today. Carolyn Francis, who is the Assistant Commissioner of the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commission, Kane Thornton, who's Head of Strategic Impact at CDC Data Centres, and Stan Krapan, Chief Executive of Solar Victoria. A little bit more about our 2025 30-year infrastructure strategy. This time we made 45 recommendations, which were very, very focused. And that was almost half the number of recommendations that we'd made in the previous update of the strategy in 2021. We also included 8 future options. The future options were things that we thought were a good idea for the government to consider in the next 5 years, but weren't put as in the same level of criticality as the 45 recommendations. And I'll mention one of those future options today. Many of you might have been engaged throughout the development of the strategy or the draft. We had really broad community engagement and over 300 submissions. And all that feedback was considered and incorporated into the final strategy. Every single one of our recommendations was updated. And we also had 2 new recommendations and 1 new future option. So thank you so much if you were involved in that process. So today we're going to do a deep dive into energy and in particular the energy transition and all that contains. So where are we now with the energy transition? The Victorian government has set targets to generate 65% of electricity from renewables by 2030, and that increases to 95% by 2035. It has also set storage and offshore wind targets. VicGrid is planning for transition infrastructure to develop renewable energy zones, helping to connect new large-scale renewable energy projects. And as more homes, businesses and vehicles electrify, Victoria's electricity use will increase. And data centres is also a hot topic in this space as well. So I'm going to quickly mention the 9 recommendations and options relating to energy in our 30-year strategy. We won't have time today for me to go into the detail behind these recommendations, but if you haven't had the opportunity to explore these recommendations in detail and also all the underlying evidence, then please head to our website All the information is contained there. One of the great things about Infrastructure Victoria is we publish all the supporting documentation and technical reports. So it's all there for you to dive in detail. We have a digital first strategy this time, so it's really easy for you to navigate and find the recommendations that you're most interested in. But let me do a whistle stop tour of the 9 recommendations in particular. The first one, recommendation 30, is to coordinate faster delivery of key energy infrastructure. And we know how important that project pipeline is, and for us to ensure that we know where we are when it comes to both the development of new renewable energy, but also that enabling infrastructure related to the transition. We've also recommended that we improve environmental assessments and site selection for energy projects. We know that there's significant environmental requirements, and they sometimes also overlap from a federal and a state perspective. So we've really recommended that we improve that process so we can see those projects come online as quickly and efficiently as possible. And I know Stan will have a little bit to say about this, but we're also encouraging household energy efficiency and electrification. In particular, we've said that the government should also support low-income households to go all electric. We've also suggested and recommended that we invest in home, neighbourhood and big batteries for more energy storage. We've also identified the need to determine long duration energy storage needs. Now, this is really important so that we know, particularly from a battery perspective, what Victoria needs to make sure that our grid and our energy system is really reliable. We've also recommended we develop an area-based energy plan and support renewable gas production. We also know, and this is one of the future options, so we've said this is something really important that the government starts to consider, but isn't as critical as our recommendations, which we've said the government really needs to consider and start working on in the next 5 years. But one of those looming challenges is the need for us to start considering the future of gas infrastructure. So we've recommended as a future option that the government plan for future changes to gas infrastructure and what that might mean from an industrial use perspective, but also decommissioning in places where gas use will decline. We also know that we'll need a workforce to support the energy transition, and that's really important. So one of our recommendations is around expanding TAFE in Melbourne's growth areas and some large regional centres. And that's making sure that we really focus and train students in those TAFEs to fill the skills gap, particularly around construction, energy and health. And we know having a ready and an able workforce for the energy transition is sort of a critical and enabling aspect. And I'll also mention and take you through some of the results from our most recent research into climate hazards. But one of our recommendations is that we better prepare infrastructure for climate change. And what we've seen through our research is that energy infrastructure is one of the most impacted infrastructure types from a climate hazards perspective. So one of the things that we've recommended here, and we were really pleased to see the government adopting this recommendation with the launch of the climate adaptation plans, is to produce an energy sector adaptation plan so that we really ensure that the various sectors have mapped and really have a clear path for adapting and being resilient to those climate impacts. So as I mentioned, we have recently launched our most recent piece of research, and that was called Warning Signs: Climate Change Risks to Victoria's Infrastructure. Here we looked at all of Victoria's Victorian government owned or regulated infrastructure, and we looked at that across 7 climate hazards. So what that found was that infrastructure in Victoria is quite exposed to climate hazards. We looked at the 7 different climate hazards that are most relevant for Victoria, and we looked at $318 billion worth of assets right across the state. And I'll show you some of the maps that showed. We looked at 2 time horizons, one being 2030 and one being 2070. We also looked at a low emissions and a high emissions scenario. What we found was that over $57 billion worth of assets is at risk from climate hazards in 2030, and that increases to $71 billion in 2070. What we also found, and you can see here on this map, that the 4 key types of infrastructure most at risk from climate hazards are road, rail, energy, and health infrastructure. And you can see with that really simplified map there where those assets are most located across the state. Here you can see the energy infrastructure specifically. So as I mentioned, energy is one of the key infrastructure types most at hazard across the state from climate impacts. The little grey boxes or dark grey boxes here represent over $500 million in each square of energy infrastructure that is exposed to at least one climate hazard by 2030. And so that's obviously right on the horizon. So this is something we really need to consider and think about how our infrastructure is resilient and how we adapt to those future threats of climate change. As I mentioned, this report and also the underlying technical report is available on our website, along with the recommendations that I've just mentioned. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a deep dive. We're always here if you have any questions, but have a good look into that research. I might take this opportunity to introduce our esteemed panel and also invite them to say a few words. Remember, you can submit a question via Slido under the live stream on the website. So, Carolyn, I might start with you. I'd like to introduce Carolyn Francis, the Assistant Commissioner of the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commission. Over to you, Caroline, to say a few words.
Good morning, and thanks, Jill, for your introduction and for your earlier acknowledgement of country. I am in a national role with the AEIC, but I am a proud Victorian and I live on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, so I extend my respects to them and to any First Nations people who might be on the webinar with us today. The AEIC, we're an independent national role appointed by the Commonwealth Government, and Tony Ma is the Commissioner, and I'm fortunate to work with him in this role of Assistant Commissioner along with the rest of our small team. And in a nutshell, we work to help make the energy shift smoother and fairer. Our place is really in the large-scale renewables and new transmission projects, and specifically in supporting communities to resolve their concerns and queries and being a reliable and trusted source of best practice, advice and information. I love this webinar titled Powering Through Victoria's Energy Infrastructure in a Changing Climate. And I know it means climate in the scientific weather sense, but I think in this topic, there's equally changing climate in the social sense. And that's really where our role comes in and where I'll focus some comments. I think it's a great report. It identifies some similar challenges in the Victorian energy transition to what we frequently hear in our work, both in Victoria and nationally. And it identifies opportunities that also align with what we've found in our work. And as I mentioned, especially in the grid scale renewable and the new transmission projects where our focus is. We know that energy is a rapidly changing landscape, and even since this report was released, we've seen more changes. We've got grid scale batteries increasingly being built. Wind turbines are generally getting taller and now up around the 300 metres in tip height for new proposals. Solar farms are continuing to grow in size, even with the increased efficiencies of the panels and the arrays. And hybrid proposals have become really common, where there's a bit of everything mixed into one site. And of course, data centres are front and centre in many conversations, or maybe seems at the moment like all conversations. So it's great that Kane's here to talk a bit more to those. There's been some really key advances like the release of the Victorian Transmission Plan and the declaration of the first renewable energy zones and the release of VicGrid's community engagement social value guidelines, all in the past 12 months. These provide a clearer framework in Victoria, but even then, we acknowledge that not everyone agrees with the outcomes. More work is needed on understanding what they mean in practice. For example, how do they interact with things like land use planning framework? What do they mean for existing projects? And how can the community use them to support their conversations at a project level? We also have the Commonwealth's Developer Rating Scheme, which will very soon go live, and it'll allow people to see an independent assessment of a developer's community engagement standards. It was a key recommendation of the previous Commissioner's Community Engagement Review back in 2023. And so it's going to be great to see that come to life very shortly. It's a voluntary scheme for companies to sign up to, but I guess you could ask, if not, why not, to anyone who is not getting their rating yet. And that's just to name a couple of examples, which I guess is a key observation from our work and reflected in the report, that energy is a really complex system. So many stakeholders, so many layers, so many touch points. And for communities who we work with, it can be really hard for them to find how they best engage in this process and to decide where they put their time. There's often multiple consultations underway at once. Some are at a project specific level, some are at the system planning level. They can be really large and really technical. And remember, of course, that this isn't the day job for our communities. In many cases, they didn't choose to have a renewable project or a new transmission line in their area. So we think we need to find ways to make their experience easier and better. And that's a key part of our role, is supporting community members with their concerns and inquiries and complaints about projects. We help them to get reliable information, to understand the approval and commercial processes, and to build better relationships with proponents, even when there's different views on the information or the project itself. But sometimes we find that really hard ourselves, to find that information or to understand the processes. And we have the time and connections and resources to do it. So it's always a good reminder for us of the difficulties that communities can face in the transition. Some of the proponents are doing really well, and there's projects that progress through approvals without us hearing any concerns from the community about them, which is great. But there is always and still a lot of room to improve. And there's practical things that we think can be done, like consolidating information, considering the timing from a community as well as a project perspective, and collaborating more across the sector so they're not having to repeat the same concerns time and time again and still not really feeling heard. Also finding ways that impacts can be really mitigated and that the community can actually benefit, and not just in the short term or with a small grant. Sometimes they can actually create a greater load on community by having to apply for and manage the applications for those. So long-term legacy benefits with the right support structures in place to make them work, to make them viable. In our work, we also draw out some common themes and issues and find ways to help fix them, either directly or through partnering with industries and peak groups and all levels of government. And that's, I think, where our national perspective and experience can really help. Some of these are the types of concerns that can lead to project timeframes drawing out. And for example, third-party insurance, decommissioning, cumulative impacts are a few of the things we're working on at the moment. So linking all this back to the report recommendations, better site selection and assessments are recommendations that definitely align with our own and the work that we're doing. And while coordinating faster delivery is great for business and for overall energy security, it needs to be done in a way that still supports the host community's needs and rights to be involved, including First Nations communities. Having said that, we do also hear from community about the mental health impacts and the fatigue impacts when proposals are around for years without that certainty. So a faster to yes or faster to no can at least give them that certainty. So I guess to summarise that, we agree with a lot of what's in the report, Jill. Better coordination, better engagement, better site selection, better processes, better information, all keys to getting this transition right. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn, and it's fantastic to have you here with us today, and certainly at the coalface of this energy transition, and particularly with your engagement with community. So look forward to diving into some questions. We're also joined by Kane Thornton. Kane is Head of Strategic Impact at CDC Data Centres. Kane is also on the board of VicGrid and, of course, had over 10 years at the Clean Energy Council. So, Kane, you've certainly, hot seat at the moment with data centres, and that's a theme that's been coming up a lot recently with energy. So, really look forward to having a chat with you today, and I'll let you say a few opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jill, and good morning, and great to be here. Maybe just a little bit about CDC data centers. So, as you say, I've moved really from much of my career focused on the generation supplied side of the energy system to now on the customer demand side of the energy system. CDC has been around for about 20 years. Has 19 data centers in operation and a significant pipeline both in construction phase across Australia and New Zealand, and then in various stages of development coming forward. I think it's needless to say the pretty extraordinary demand for quality, resilient, sustainable data centers across the world, and particularly here in Australia. CDC is fairly unique for a number of reasons. One of those is because the history of the organisation is focused on those mission critical, highly sensitive customers and services, and that means a couple of things. It means that reliability, redundancy, security are all really critical parts of the way in which the business operates and our data centres are built and operated. We're also unique in terms of our ownership, and I think reflecting that strategic nature of the organisation. Our shareholders include the Future Fund, the Commonwealth Super Scheme, and Infratil, so all very strategic, long-term, quality investors in our organisation. And I guess all of that translates to doing things, I think, quite differently. And just a couple of data points on that. One is all of our power is 100% backed by renewable energy. We think that's really important. All of those 19 data centers, that's the case. And the other one, which I think makes us fairly unique, is every one of the data centers that we've built used a closed circuit cooling system, which effectively, once established, uses no water in the cooling system. And that saves literally millions of litres of water on a daily basis, and is different to certainly plenty of data centers around the world and in this country. I guess just a couple of examples of why I think they are really a postcard from the future, and I think a benchmark for what we should be expecting from data centers right across the country and indeed the world. I guess, as I said, obviously significant interplay with the energy system. Data centers use significant amounts of energy. Energy is critical to ensuring availability of that critical infrastructure. I think, Jill, many of the recommendations that you've just summarised, I think, are incredibly relevant to data centers and the energy transition here in Victoria more widely. And I think what they do is go to this real challenge of trying to provide certainty in a world that is fundamentally uncertain. And, that certainty is critical because a lot of this infrastructure is being built or expected to be built by the private sector. It is capital intensive, whether it's data centers or transmission or renewable generation. They're long-lived assets. They are dependent on a whole range of factors over the life of those assets that investors need to have some level of comfort about. But they're doing that in an uncertain world. If you look back maybe just 10 years ago, you wouldn't have imagined where the energy transition would be right now. The rate at which the cost of renewables have come down, the rate at which Victorian households have taken up rooftop solar or batteries. You wouldn't have anticipated some of the challenges that we've had at a geopolitical level, the re-election of Donald Trump for a second time, the tariff wars, the COVID challenges and the impact that had on supply chains. some of the policy and regulatory challenges that we've faced, or indeed the challenges and the constraints on building out transmission infrastructure across Victoria or the nation. And so, I think it's really important that policymakers, regulators, industry, and of course the work that Infrastructure Victoria does really looks to bring together the different threads that are critically important to trying to provide that certainty, that coordination, that leadership in an otherwise uncertain world. And yeah, look forward to the conversation, maybe sharing some more examples of those challenges and the opportunity to better coordinate and better lead the transition across Victoria.
Thanks, Kane. Great to have you here. We're also joined by Stan Kripan, PSM, Chief Executive of Solar Victoria. Stan, you've had a long history in sustainability and most recently sort of at the forefront of households and businesses moving into renewable energy. So welcome, and would invite you to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Jill, and good morning, everybody. Look, Solar Victoria is a group within Victoria's Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, DECA, and we deliver two flagship programs, the Victorian Energy Upgrades Program and the Solar Homes Program. They're really flagship emissions reduction and energy programs, two of the largest in the country, and with a really strong focus on our customers, both households and businesses, and also industry engagement. So that's been part of the kind of the secret sauce, I guess, in terms of the success of some of what we've delivered over those years. Solar Homes still provides rebates and interest-free loans for households, and that's predominantly, as the name would suggest, for solar PV and for really efficient, energy-efficient electric hot water heat pumps. And we've served over 500,000 customers across Victoria since we were created in 2018. We also deliver, and we're the first state to deliver a solar for apartments program. We've upgraded over 200 apartment buildings, mostly in that sort of low to mid-range, mid-height apartment buildings, which has been really exciting. We're seeing strong growth there. And we also do solar for community housing organisations. In the past, we've done solar for business, rebates, electric vehicle subsidies, a whole range of incentives, really encouraging uptake of technology, but also supporting people to participate, I guess, in the energy transition. I'll come back to that in a moment. Victorian Energy Upgrades is the largest energy efficiency program in the country. It's about $700 million per year is directly invested in that program, and about $2 billion if you take into account the trade of those the certificates that are created as a result of those upgrades. As the name would suggest, energy upgrades, particularly with a focus on energy and electrical energy efficiency in households. So all appliances now are able to obtain upfront discounts in Victoria to enable electrification, particularly with a state so dependent on gas with 2 million homes connected to gas, being able to support the government's ambition. And I think what makes commercial and environmental sense, which is to get those households less reliant on gas over time. And so we support with upfront discounts, heat pumps, home heating and cooling upgrades. And that's the biggest part of the program, incidentally. And about half of those upgrades are replacing existing gas furnaces. Induction cooktops, we also recently launched discounts for insulation. We're the first state again to do that. That will open up from social housing currently to the broader public on the 1st of October. And we've also been recently consulting on hydronic heating discounts as well. In terms of the business side of that program, commercial and industrial solar, again, first state to offer upfront discounts for PV systems between 30 and 200 kilowatts. And that program also extends to really bespoke upgrades of a commercial and industrial nature. So if you think building upgrades, building electrification, commercial building electrification, and then industrial facilities for both solar, electrical and gas efficiency. The program is growing and the government has committed to that in terms of it being a real centrepiece around emissions reduction through the funding of a strategic review that we completed. And there's a bill before Parliament that we're hoping will be passed before Parliament rises in a few weeks, which will really position the program for the future. It's been extended to 2045, a real strong focus on being more oriented towards customers, both households and businesses, being a bit more flexible and streamlined, and taking into account, I guess, the practical reality of what energy transition looks like, including upgrades of what I'll call an adjacent nature that are enabling of other technologies. So if you think of a home upgrade, for instance, it may require a new electrical circuit, a new switchboard, that sort of thing, taking into account a broader sort of concept of additionality. We also do training and workforce development, which I know IV has been very keen on, is the workforce capacity and capability. We've trained over 6,000 workers in both electrical and plumbing work, obviously PV at the centre of that, but we've also provided support to about 50 female apprentices in both plumbing and electrical trades, which is a really important aspect in terms of that workforce being truly representative and women being able to participate in that sort of growth. And then an audit and safety program. I wanted to come back to that focus on customer, because for me, I take a really practical approach to energy transition, and we've now for over 8 years been very much at the forefront of supporting Victorians to participate in the energy transition. So I don't take them as individual upgrades or just thinking about the technology, but actually every customer that we serve is now a participant in energy transition, whether they're upgrading, a central gas heating system to a heating and cooling, an air conditioner, effectively a heat pump, or they're upgrading their water heating from gas to electric. They are all then participants in the energy transition. And so our approach and philosophy is very much to be meeting customers where they are, wherever they are on that journey, and for whatever reason, whether it's to save money, as most of them are, or whether it's for environmental purposes, whether they are just upgrading one appliance, or they're upgrading their whole home during a reno or something like that. And obviously we provide direct support for those technologies, but also I think there's more work to be done, and I really welcome the work and the challenge that IV has put forward to government and others. It's not all about government, it's also about industry participants, which is about how do we provide benefits that are fit for the future and for the energy transition as well. So each one of those customers that is upgrading, whether they're installing PV or the 70 or 80,000 people who now have a home battery, they are participants not only in the energy transition, but also they're generating energy capacity, they're generating power, or they're storing power and creating more flex in the system. And I think there's more work to be done about really valuing those benefits that they're providing to the whole energy grid. I'd really like to explore some of that in the conversation. And the final thing I'd say about that participation, and also how we value that participation and the benefits that they provide to the system as a whole, is that it's incredibly important for social licence. And we know there's a direct link between people who are participating and their support for technologies like solar or batteries, for instance, or EVs. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Dan. And I love that lens of participants in the energy transition. It's a great lens, and social license. We've already received a couple of questions about that, but that is absolutely a topic that we're going to explore this morning. A reminder, you can submit your questions through Slido, and thank you for those. We've received a lot already, so we might as well just dive in and get started. The first question is around better coordination between government and industry. What's the biggest thing holding that back, and what needs to change? And Carolyn, I might throw to you first if you've got a lens on that, and Kane and Stan, of course, chime in at any stage.
Thanks, Jill. And I guess sort of with that lens of our part of the system in the renewable projects and the new transition and working with community, I think sometimes the thing that holds us back is really just starting, being willing to try without maybe the perfect conditions, and to show that bit of trust and boldness, and just learn from that as we progress. There's definitely real things like commercial sensitivities at a project level. But there's also things like some silos across industry, across different parts of government, both state, federal and local as well. So I think some of the recommendations in the report and initiatives that are already being done or developed will help with this. It is a really complex ecosystem, so there is more work needed on finding those specific needs or where specifically that coordination might be breaking down, and just being willing to share more information and try those new approaches. I think we've seen just this week, the Clean Energy Council announced a proposal for better coordination of community benefits, particularly in regional and rural areas where most of the renewable infrastructure is being hosted. So, there's a lot of detail on a proposal like that would need to be worked through. But I guess when current processes aren't working, it just takes a spark and a bold idea to try and break through and try something different.
Thanks, Carolyn. It is a complex ecosystem. Stan and Kane, you bring different lens of that ecosystem. What do you think the sort of biggest barriers or things that we need to do to make a smoother transition?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it necessarily goes to the point of barriers, but one thing that I do notice, and having been in this game for a long time across sort of various different spectrums, from waste and recycling to energy and other infrastructure, is I think there are really fantastic relationships and a great engagement between industry and peak bodies and government at a strategic level. So whether it's about planning for things like renewable energy zones, or whether it's about energy transition around energy, renewable energy targets, around the climate change and emissions reduction targets, that sort of thing. So at a strategic level, I think it's very well coordinated and there's lots of industry engagement. I think where it becomes challenging is at a very local level. So where the community is not generally engaging at that level, where they're thinking about 20 and 30-year infrastructure plans and strategies. But as soon as it's very local, and that may be the first time that they see something, and I've just come back from being in the north of the state for a couple of days, the first thing that they hear about something is infrastructure being installed on a farm perhaps next to them. And that's where I think the breakdown is. And it's got to be really timely at the earliest possible stage. And recognising that these communities, that many communities in regional Victoria are hosting lots of different infrastructure. It's not just a solar farm, but it may be also transmission lines and things like that. And they may have other sort of concerns, even from a practical perspective, around the reliability of their own energy supply. And so taking that sort of more holistic, I guess, approach is really important. I think that's where we could do more in terms of how we engage, particularly with local proponents and local communities at the project stage.
Yeah, Jill, not a lot to add other than to agree strongly with both Carolyn and Stan's points. And I see this now in the data centre sector, a sector that's moving extraordinarily quickly, probably doesn't have the benefits of the sort of institutions that have been established in other parts of the energy sector. And, the work of the AEIC, for example, on the generation side, I think has been really high quality to help bring a level of coordination and collaboration. And, I think it's that type of institutions that we're going to need in sectors like the data center space and other rapidly evolving sectors, because as Stan said, this stuff gets really difficult, particularly at a local level, particularly where often you've got industry proponents who are essentially competitors, and it makes it difficult for them to otherwise collaborate. And I think sometimes that means we miss an opportunity to really maximize the benefits or to local communities, or really enhance how we kind of communicate and engage with communities. So there's definitely more to be done. I think there's some really good foundations, but it's going to take a lot more effort, particularly as the pace of change across the whole energy transition accelerates.
Thanks, Kane. We've got quite a few questions on solar, so we might dive into that for a bit. And Stan, I might throw this one to you to start with. Do you think we've reached the point where investment in household battery deserves as much policy attention as rooftop solar did a decade ago?
It definitely needs attention. And I think I alluded to that in my opening remarks. I think what we're already seeing is huge take-up. Like the last 12 months, it's world-leading. I think it's well over 400,000 batteries have now been installed under the cheaper home batteries from the Commonwealth. But prior to that, both New South Wales and Victoria were offering incentives. I think we started offering incentives in 2009, and we literally had to work with distribution businesses on which suburbs and postcodes were suitable to host a battery. And now essentially the question is around visibility. They're automatically connected. It's really world leading, particularly around the permitting, etc. Where I think that we do need to coordinate and really catch up in a sense. And I don't see them necessarily as mutually exclusive either. When I think about these assets, it includes PV and batteries and also all electric homes. Because you've got EVs in many of these, and EVs have also been taken up hugely in the last couple of years, is how do you see those assets as part of a fleet that are a part of the grid of the future? And how do we value that so that we're not just thinking about this sort of unidirectional huge power stations and infrastructure that are feeding into everybody's homes, but where there is a two-way flow and where it's much more interactive. It requires incredible coordination, but also smarts, and there's a lot of investment in AI from DBs and at the transmission level. Making that as efficient as possible, I think, is really important so that we're not over producing. But I do think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around coordinating the batteries. At the moment, I think the indications, despite I think perhaps some concerns around that, are that most of the batteries are uncoordinated. I think it's about 80%. But even when they're uncoordinated, because they're operating in the customer's interest and they're set to that, it does appear that they are reducing energy bills for everybody, whether they've got a battery or PV or not, and that they're providing some effectively demand shifting and some alleviating of peak demand on the grid by shifting demand through the way that they store and discharge. I think how we value that is probably the most pressing thing, and the issue that I'm interested in, particularly around. There's lots of discussions around whether virtual power plants, etc., and coordination work. I think the only way they could work is if there is a better value proposition for customers, and if we demystify what those value propositions are.
Thanks, Stan. Kane, dive in.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think this is an area that I'm excited by and optimistic about, and that is, the level of work that's underway now, particularly by market bodies and, to a degree, the network businesses, the generators, the technology suppliers, about how we can really optimize the energy system and take advantage of what, whether it's a data center or a household solar and battery system, it's some pretty sophisticated technology with a lot of capability. And the work that bodies like AEMO are doing, I think, in the data center space, there's a lot of work around highly technical things like fault ride through. Is just one of many examples that's looking to leverage that technical capability, make sure it really works and supports the grid, and ultimately delivers an energy system that's more reliable and at as lower cost as possible. So there's a lot going on there, a lot of collaboration. I think collaboration's critically important, and long may it continue, because we need to take advantage of the technology that's being developed and installed for the good of customers.
Well, it's a nice segue to our next question. I think we've probably covered a little bit of it off, but it's about energy storage. So household batteries have a long payoff time for smaller households. Is it more cost effective to use distributed batteries, whether community neighbourhood batteries or utility facilities, rather than leverage individual household batteries to create virtual power plants? Stan, do you have a view on that one?
I'd say it's all of the above. And to be honest, I'm not sure that many of those 80,000 customers that I mentioned, 400,000 nationally, that have installed a battery are doing an ROI. I think there's a real emotive aspect to that. And also the offer is just so good. Up until changes in May, our records indicate that the Commonwealth discount was about a 50% upfront discount. Like, that's firstly unprecedented. Also, the prices have come down. So I think what might have been a value prop and an ROI, even last year, is very different this year. And I think what people are doing is they're optimising their existing asset, which is PV, 400,000 in, 800,000 in Victoria, 4 million nationally, systems, and people wanting to store that and use it, and increasingly expand those systems. So we're seeing a lot of replacement and expansions of them, and then using it with a car and that sort of thing. So I think the value proposition has changed, but I do think also there's a place for neighbourhood batteries, and I'm really excited. One of the reasons that we put a lot of effort into providing an upfront discount for commercial industrial solar with Victorian Energy upgrades is there's just this huge untapped potential of flat north-facing, and you know, let's argue about whether east or west might make sense as well, but at least really well-positioned, flat, easily accessed roof space in places that are well located, close to city centres, close to the demand. So if you think data centres, etc. And so I think all of those warehouses should be covered in solar PV and or batteries. And so I think the opportunity around industrial precincts that are generating power locally, storing it and dispatching it and providing some flex, etc., doesn't have the same social license issues as, you know, solar farms and wind farms. And we do need all of the above, but I think it's a huge untapped potential. I think, you know, some industry advocates are calling it the missing middle. And I think there's been work done just in Victoria alone that there's about 7 gigawatts of potential on those commercial roofs. And so I think it's a combination of household batteries and let people get what they want, neighbourhood batteries, and I think that'll be a combination of community owned as well as perhaps owned by distribution businesses, etc. And then batteries located close to very large commercial and industrial systems.
Thanks, Stan. We've got quite a few questions here on data centres. So, Kate, I might throw this one to you. Is the recent data centre boom incompatible with our net zero goal, given the huge demand for energy? And what role will urban planning play in balancing the promotion of renewables with the significant increase in energy demand? Double-pronged question there. Kate, I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Certainly hot topics and really important topics for the nation, for local communities, and the data center sector. Maybe on the planning question first. I mean, I think clearly there is work to do as far as what the expectation is and what the policy and regulatory framework is in relation to where data centers are developed. Certainly ours have always been developed in those heavy industrial regions and areas. Clearly that makes a lot of sense from the community's perspectives. But more recently, we have seen controversy in relation to the location of data centres, and I think it's something that governments clearly in Victoria and around the country are really leaning into and considering how they can ensure that there's a clear signal and guardrails that they're being built and developed in the right areas. And I think inevitably that's going to mean trending out as well to more regional parts of the country. They're complex bits of infrastructure and complex sort of trade-offs and judgments about siting and location, but that's an area where there is a lot of conversation and a lot of, I think, reform underway. In terms of the compatibility of data centres with our climate change goals, I said in my opening comment that we're using 100% renewable energy in our data centres. We made a commitment a number of years ago to be net zero by 2030. We've already achieved that. And so I guess what that says to me is that if done well, data centres certainly don't detract from our net zero objectives, and indeed they can help to support and accelerate it. And in part that's by building scale. Data centers are very good customers for energy projects and renewable energy projects in particular. They're long-lived operations. They're very good off-takers, and I think therefore they can play a really positive role. There's been a lot of media reporting in the last couple of days about the work underway by energy ministers to provide a policy framework that will essentially require data center operators to come with new renewable generation. Again, I think the principle of that is fairly straightforward. There's some real complexity in the policy and how it works, which I think ministers recognise and are determined to get right. But if we get that right, then data centres here in Victoria and around the country should actually be helping the transition, helping to build scale, helping with significant investments in the electricity grid that actually builds resilience into the electricity grid, which in turn, lowers costs for all customers and in turn creates a more resilient electricity system that allows us to therefore accelerate more quickly towards a cleaner energy system and supports our emissions targets.
Thanks, Kane. We've got a couple of questions here on community engagement and social license. So the first one, community concerns are often raised as a reason projects are delayed. How do you suggest the government balance the need to deliver energy infrastructure quickly with giving communities a genuine voice in the planning process? And Carolyn, I'll throw that one to you to start with, but I know Kane and Stan, it'd be great to get your lens on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And this is, some of the heart of our work. We spend a lot of time working with communities, listening to them, not just on projects, the sort of technical parts of the projects, but their experience of the engagement with those projects and with the broader system, and that includes the planning processes. But honestly, some of the experiences are pretty difficult to hear. I've had people on the phone in tears, feeling completely helpless or feeling where they don't trust the information that they're hearing, and that's really challenging for those community members. At the same time, in our role, we meet with a lot of proponents, and in some cases, it's not that they're doing a bad job of engaging with their community. It is that community does not want that project or does not think that is the right location for renewable energy or transmission, and it's in some ways there's no amount of engagement that will change that position. So and that's even before getting into the formal approval process, which is often where we hear a lot of community concerns as well. They don't understand the process. They find it impersonalised in some ways, talking to a system or not getting that direct engagement with the decision makers. So I agree, it's definitely necessary to balance the different needs and at some point draw a line and make that decision. But I think if there's clearer communications of processes, that would definitely help. Also, just being really upfront about what can and can't be changed and considered. So when can the community have their say? The earlier the better. Giving them fair time to be able to input, adequate time and the right support so that they can feel like they're part of the process. Like I said earlier, it's not their day job. So giving a short window of opportunity to comment in the middle of a harvest season does not feel like a really good opportunity for a community member to engage in those processes. And I think the final one for me is just the transparency of the decision-making process. So if someone does go to that effort to engage, to put in their concerns or their objections or to ask their questions, the mechanism for them to know how that has been considered in the process. It's not necessarily whether they got what they asked for or not, but it's how was it considered, and why or why not was there any changes. So at least they can understand the decision, even if they continue to not agree.
Yeah, Jill, I agree with a lot of what Carolyn said, and I kind of, have experienced a lot of those challenges in the, on the generation side over the years, and now see many of the similar characteristics in the data center development pathway. And I think I think getting that balance right is really critically important. I think the planning regime and processes aren't always fit for purpose. They're not fit for purpose necessarily for the investors and the developers or the community. And I think, of course, there's a balance in all of that, but I think everyone's broadly looking for the same thing, which is transparency, clarity of the process, and then some efficiency to make sure that we work through these issues. We get outcomes that are balanced, that give investors certainty and respond to and address as many of the, the genuine concerns where they might be held in community. It does also then flow through to some sort of bigger questions and challenges around how we make sure that people are well informed. And I see this in the data center sector at the moment, an extraordinary amount of misinformation. A lot of people's understanding of data centers as being imported from the United States, where things are very different in all sorts of areas and ways. There's a lot more regulatory framework and measures here in Australia than the US, but that's helping to inform people. It's actually making them more anxious than they might otherwise be. And then I think, a role for all of us, industry, community leaders, governments, regulators, everyone, to help to kind of lean into that, provide much more clarity, try and give community some certainty about what this might look like and how it might operate. And I saw this in the renewable energy sector. I now see it in the data center sector, where projects are done well and people actually come and have a look at them and have an experience of them. Often the response is, "Oh, actually, this is fine. I can't hear it. It's not invasive. I'm quite comfortable with it being somewhere in the vicinity, and they can get on with their lives." So I think that's a really important piece that goes to the heart of both the industries and the energy transition social license, but also a really important part of the the planning processes that often get crunched or ignored by virtue of some of those processes and their adequacy or not.
It's clearly a key issue both in the energy transition and social license and data centers seem like they're in the hot seat at the moment. It does take us to a question around how we manage the sequencing of renewable energy projects, but also things like data centers and how that fits into the ecosystem. We've got a question here about noting the analysis of Victoria's long duration energy storage needs. How can energy projects and the need for energy, including things like data centers, be managed in this context? Are there implications for the sequencing of approvals and also consequences for the sequencing of the renewable energy supply pipeline? Stan, I'll throw to you first, obviously, from how that works with businesses and individual households also becoming participants, as you said, in that renewable energy pipeline.
Thanks, Jill. Look, I think it's fair to say that in terms of long-term energy storage, that we're only seeing the first of those sort of projects come on stream now. I think where I've seen it done well, the engagement with the community firstly happens really at the early concept phase and then continues throughout. It's not a sort of transactional nature. And I think the same goes for the planning of that the planning process needs to be really well communicated to the community from the outset. And it's not really my area of expertise, but if I draw some parallels with other sectors that have looked at social license, so both mining and the resource recovery sector, accountability for the promises that are made in that early stage and how it is that those can be resolved once the facility is up and operating is really important as well from a community perspective. There's been a lot of reform work done in Victoria, not specifically around long-term battery storage, but particularly around streamlining environmental approvals. And I think there's more to be done there with the establishment of the national EPA. And it'll be interesting to see how that streamlines both the environmental considerations and environmental approvals, as well as for facilities, particularly those that are nationally significant, to get up and running as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Stan. Kane, I'll let you have the last word on this. Obviously, you've got multiple lenses from your background from a supply chain and industry, from a CEC perspective, VicGrid, and now data centers. What are your thoughts around the sequencing challenges.
Yeah, it's a wicked problem, Jill. And, I see the great work being done at bodies like AEMO and now VicGrid in trying to plan what the future system might need to look like and the different characteristics. And that timing issue is a real challenge. And if you look at the pathway to developing an offshore wind farm or a new piece of transmission infrastructure, indeed, in contrast to a data center, which is very quick in many cases, and so there's a real tension here between how we bring all these pieces together. Yes, we need to strengthen the grid. Yes, we need new forms of generation and storage and long duration storage. We're seeing the time it takes to develop Snowy 2.0 as an example. These are all really important parts of the jigsaw puzzle. But they've all got very different timelines. And of course, add to that mix the inevitable phase out of our coal generation. Bring all this together is a really big challenge. We've got some really great organisations that are navigating through that. And again, linking back to the work that Infrastructure Victoria is doing in this report, I think, how do we harmonise that? How do we collaborate across those challenges, and how do we give ourselves some optionality that there'll be things that come at us that we don't necessarily foresee or can't necessarily control. So big challenge. The good news is there's lots of really smart people and great organisations leaning into it, and we have to do it together.
Well, thank you, Kane. That is a beautiful note for us to end on. And a huge thank you to you, Stan, Carolyn, for your insights today. I'm going to apologise to some of our viewers because we have so many questions. I think we could honestly have made this a half-day panel event with the number of questions that we have coming through. So it's clearly a topic of great interest. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. There is a quick survey that pops up afterwards. We do encourage you to complete that. It does help us pick future topics and also improve our webinars. But to our panel, thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for a really interesting topic, an important topic for Victoria's future.